afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for what promises to be an interesting, if possibly depressing, panel on decoding Lebanon's financial situation. I'm Maha Yahya. I'm the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center, and I'm truly delighted to welcome three friends and colleagues. Amr Saad, who's the managing director of emerging markets at BlackRock, Haneen Al-Sayed, at the World Bank. If I start with your titles, Haneen, I won't finish immediately. Needless to say, she's probably one of the most important authorities today on the social side of things. And Ishaq Diwan, who is, كمان multiple titles, who's now a professor at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, and also heads a research, I think he just established a research unit that is looking at the political economy of the region of the Middle East and North Africa. We're here to discuss today the economic and financial meltdown in Lebanon, and its social repercussions. As you all know, Lebanon has been going through a extremely difficult situation since October 17th. However, the financial and economic difficulties did not start with October 17th, and I would venture to say were actually triggered it to some extent. And we're going to begin the discussion with, I'll be asking a series of questions of our panelists, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. Ishaq, let me begin with you and ask you to characterize the current economic situation and how did we get here? Just to
get us started.
To get us started,
right.
Especially since many people are saying, I think when the Queen of England, when the 2007-2008 economic crisis happened, she actually asked a group of economists, why didn't anybody predict this? So could this have been predicted? I think it was a lecture at LSE. So could this have been predicted, and how did we get here?
And nobody was able to answer, but that's
no one. Yeah, exactly.
I'll let you answer this one, perhaps. Look, let me start by saying that it's very humbling to be speaking to all of you. I have many friends, and I know many specialists in the room that know much more about the Lebanese economy than I do. I hope that whatever we say is simply the beginning of a conversation, and that we will hear more from you. My expertise on Lebanon is limited to observations over the years and to one paper where I looked carefully at political connections and the performance of the private sector. Anyway, to come to your question, Lebanon is clearly experiencing now what we call in macroeconomics a sudden stop. Capital inflows have stopped. They have realized that the country is not creditworthy enough to flow into the economy and into the banking sector. Now, the first big impact of that, the tremendously large impact, is that our current account is in deficit at the tune of 20-25% of GDP. The country has been living on very large capital inflows for years and decades. And so many parts of the economy are deeply embedded into living on capital inflows. The first big impact is on the availability of dollars. We import much, much more than we export. And so the dollar has become extremely scarce, and most firms in the real economy live on both borrowing and imports, both of which have become extremely scarce compared to what it was just a few months ago. Second, the banking sector is deeply affected as well by the fact that the real economy is in bad shape, but also depositors noticed that there is something wrong going on. There was the beginning of a run on banks, and there's a bit of a cardiac arrest, if you like, starting in the banking sector. And that was limited, at least in the short term, by the imposition of soft capital controls. So none of you can take a lot of dollars and cash out of the economy. This has hit, again, the real economy, the private sector, private firms. There's not enough liquidity, enough dollars. We're starting to see layouts, and the social cost is already there. That's the second round. And the third round is the fiscal accounts. The fiscal deficits are much harder to finance. Indeed, the revenues of the state are coming down, and so the fiscal situation that was weak is becoming even weaker. And that is actually from the beginning, the debt, the growing debt relative to the size of the economy is the cancer that both required these big inflows and make this whole Lebanon as a bank not creditworthy. And so we have basically a big balance of payment crisis, the beginning of a banking crisis, a deteriorating fiscal crisis. So we're in the middle of a deepening triple crisis. We've seen many financial crises around the world. Few of them are triple crises, and those are the worst. That's unfortunately the situation.
Thank you, Amir. Amir, let me turn to you. Would you agree with, with Ishaq's characterization of this? But I think even more, given what we're hearing, it's clear that this has been building up for some time. So could this have been prevented in some way, where we are today? And just on top of this, since October 17th, when the capital controls or the soft capital, unannounced capital controls kicked in, and the increasing financial and economic tightening that we're seeing across the board, our policymakers seems to have do very little. I mean, there doesn't seem to be much action on this front. On the contrary, whatever little decision making has been done seems to have been left to the central bank first and foremost, and to the banking sector more than anything else. So there's no real structure or internal consistency, at least that we can see. So is that approach sustainable? Can we continue along those lines? And where would we be going if we continue in this way?
Yeah, thanks a lot. And just like Ishaq, I'm also very much thankful.
Amir, you need to turn on your...
Okay. Just like Ishaq, I'm also thankful. Thank you very much for inviting me, Maha. And I'm also one of those people who very rarely looked at Lebanon. I've sort of have an experience with a number of other financial crisis countries. So a few weeks back or a few months back, I started sitting down and looking at the numbers more carefully. So if you don't mind, I'm going to take my experience and take my answers as more of an international. Take my answers as more of indicative of what happens elsewhere in situations like this. My first, I'm going to make 2 points, if you don't mind. The first is sort of very much a variation of the theme of what Ishaq said, which is that at its very core, Lebanon's problem is that for multiple years as a country, as an economy, we seem to have lived well beyond of our means. Right? The productive capacity of this country were never equal to the demands that the private sector, and more importantly, unfortunately, the public sector requested from those resources. That gap, the fact that we cannot produce as much as we want to demand, created this incredible need for borrowing elsewhere. That's the only way you can cover yourself. The only way you can cover that gap between demand and between supply is by resorting to external indebtedness. The numbers are actually quite scary and quite large. Sometime around the turn of the century, last century, 2000, we were net creditors to the rest of the world, right? We had around 100 percentage points of our GDP in net credit. By the time this crisis happened, we were at minus 100. We were able to not only run our foreign assets abroad, we ended up borrowing. As an economy, this is not just the public sector, huh? We ended up borrowing 100 percentage points of GDP. The problem with this debt, this overhang of debt, is that you have to pay it, right? And the interest payment, the debt service on that incredibly large external indebtedness, which itself, again, it's not just the public sector, it's the public sector and the private sector itself, started sucking away quite a bit of resources from this economy. And so long as those resources were being lent to us, right? Some people you can imagine this concept of a Ponzi scheme. So long as those resources were being lent to us, the game could continue. It's like a musical chairs. Sometime around 2017, that game stopped, or that game slowed down. And earlier this year, sort of in October, that game completely stopped, and that funding completely disappeared. So you end up with this sudden, the point that I made, this sudden stop of resources in an economy that is desperately in need of resources. And these numbers are not small. They're measured, we can go through the numbers later on, they're measured in the lower tens of billions of dollars. So this is an economy that needed around $10 billion of economy just to keep the game going. And suddenly those resources disappeared as a result of this recognition by the international community, by agents, broadly speaking, that we cannot afford to keep on extending that game over and over. We get to where we are right now through the three crises that is very beautifully articulated. The fiscal crisis, a banking sector / liquidity crisis, but also most importantly, a balance of payments crisis. If nothing is done, right? If nothing is done very short term, you get into these very dangerous non-linearities, right? You get into these if you allow the system to adjust the system will adjust. At some point, we cannot print money. We as an economy cannot print resources out of nowhere, right? As a result, if those resources are not available, the system will adjust by itself. And there are two levers to the adjustment, right? The first is economic activity, right? You could get into a recession of a magnitude which is exactly what's been happening right now. So that absence of liquidity, that absence of funding that I mentioned, is already translating into people not having resources to continue the game going. And the way you react to it is by firing people, closing shops, right? Tightening belts very, very aggressively. And you don't need to do fancy math and fancy econometrics of running a bunch of elasticities of imports to come up with a GDP contraction, if we allow this to continue by itself, that is measured in the double digit, right? So it's not out of the question to see this economy contracting at north of 10% if we don't resort to more internally consistent solutions of the kind that Maha was asking. We'll ask about, I suspect, in a bit, and you will ask as well. Absent that, there's another lever in this economy that could also adjust, which is the exchange rate. Now, the exchange rate could also be the lever, be the tool of internal adjustment, unruly adjustment. And you could get to a point where the currency becomes unanchored. So far, for reasons that we can get into, the currency remains, I know it doesn't feel that way, but the currency remains relatively well anchored because monetary policy has been kept extremely tight. Right? But it's tough to see that the tightness of liquidity that is allowing the currency to be stable is also extremely painful economically. So to Maha's question, if we don't do something internally consistent, you could see two things happening at a scale that is significantly higher, more dangerous than what we seem to be seeing right now. The economy could contract extremely sharply, and the exchange rate could devalue, and it could depreciate and weaken in a level that is unruly, unanchored. And let me stop there.
Thank you, Amir. You're talking about a significant contraction in the economy. You're talking about the unanchoring, the kind of chaotic devaluation of the Lebanese lira. These will have significant, already now we're seeing significant social repercussions with layoffs, with a potential shortage of goods, with businesses closing, so on and so forth. So basically what you're describing is the current scenario multiplied by many. So I'm going to turn to Haneen here and ask you, Haneen, if you could at least give us a sense of what are the current social repercussions of what we're witnessing and how things could devolve from here moving forward.
Thank you, Maha. So unlike my two colleagues, I have been working on Lebanon for some time, a little bit over 10 years, over a decade, and I've been working on the social and human development sectors. So, indeed, we're very concerned because we think whichever way, and even if managed, the crisis will have big impact on people's lives. Already it has been, particularly on the poor and vulnerable. And there will be many, many people who will become poor and vulnerable if things continue as they are. So, just to give you one kind of scenario that we are working with, what we might call a crisis scenario for 2020, Let's say we talk about an inflation rate of about 22%. This is coming from different, macro estimates, and GDP contraction, not double digits. I'm not even going there, but let's say 5%. Poverty rates in Lebanon, extreme poverty rate, would double from what it is today at 10% to 20%. Now, what is extreme poverty rate? This is the number of people who cannot afford basic food needs. Today, quantified at about $5.50 per day per person. So that would double from 10% to 20%, and we're talking about something like 700,000 people will fall under the food poverty line. If we go to another poverty line, which is food plus other things that people consume, we're talking about potentially 1.5 million people who fall under that poverty rate. I think now, okay, in crises, we know there's some adjustment. I mean, these numbers are without adjustment, nothing mitigating them like a government program, safety net, or also people naturally, households will adjust. They may eat less meat and spend less on expensive things, and this is a natural part of adjustment. We don't worry about it. But where we do worry is that families, for example, will start to pull their children out of school. They can't afford even the nominal registration fees for education, or skimp on essential health care. So this is where we do start to get worried and should be part of any program, which I'll talk about a bit later. But already in Lebanon, by the way, before the crises, you had high dropout rates of Lebanese, and especially of boys. For boys among the poor households, by the age of 18, only 35% of them are still in school. This is pre-crises. So this is something most people, they think dropouts not a problem. Lebanon, we have the best education system, what have you. Yes, you do. At the top, you have an excellent education system. But in 2011-12, only 35% of boys, Lebanese boys in the poor households, was still left in school. So you can imagine with the kind of circumstances Lebanon is will go through, that this will even get worse. So I'll stop at that.
Haneen, before actually you stop, let me just develop this further with you. I mean, we already know that poverty is concentrated in certain areas. So if we're looking at the geography of the country, we already know that in Tripoli, Akkar, Nabatieh, I mean, these have some of the highest poverty rates in the country. Are your simulations indicating what would happen also in these regions? Because from my understanding, we're already seeing a crisis mode when it comes to food, at least, in some of these areas.
I mean, unfortunately, we don't really have that data to be able to do those simulations by region per se. But indeed, as you say, poverty in Lebanon has shifted. And a decade ago, it was much more concentrated in the south. It has shifted to the north, to the Bekaa, to those areas. And this is where there's also very high unemployment rates. So you would expect that this would even be more challenging going forward. Indeed.
And in similar crises, the implications of children dropping out of school?
Yeah, absolutely. This is, as I said, I mean, it's very important because this is their future, human capital that's going to be degraded and lost. So it's something that must be addressed in this crisis. This is not talking about quality of education, that's a whole other issue, but just even the access of the poor children from poor families, boys and girls, because even though now girls have a higher enrollment rate, but that could also change during a crisis. And we've seen it in Indonesia, where kids were pulled out of school, even in Korea during the financial crisis. Korea, an upper middle income country, but there was still impact on education enrollment during the crisis.
Problem is, I think, in these crises, girls get pulled out of school to save money, and then boys are sent to work. And this is kind of the problem. Saad, let me turn to you and get perhaps your commentary on what has already been said by both Amer and Haneen. And if you could talk a little bit about what kind of mitigating measures that the Lebanese government should be taking or could be taking to protect some of, on the economic front. We'll come back to the social, Haneen, in a second, but at least on the economic front, what are the issues that can be done at this point, or they should be doing at this point?
If you don't mind, I want to go back a little bit to the past to put some of the structural issues that we're dealing with on the table to broaden the discussion. So we don't simply speak of a cancer that is removed. I mean, we need to know what was the problem with the economy in the past and what would be the upside in the future if some policies are taken. I mean, interestingly, the main book on financial crisis by Rogoff and Reinhardt is called This Time It's Different. I mean, this relates to your question about whether this was foreseeable, preventable. In every crisis, there is a narrative that this time is different, and this is why there is a crisis. You know, if there is a realization that we're getting into a crisis, some prevention will be taken before, and there wouldn't be a crisis. And so you know, the sense until a few months ago in Lebanon was that this time is different. And yet there were many Cassandras out saying, you know, this system cannot stay on for very long. It's accumulating debt at a much faster rate. Interest rates are higher than growth. And so, you know, something is wrong. So when did it start going wrong? In a sense, you know, some of you were asking, who are the guilty parties? When should have our governors of the central bank, of the state, the prime minister realize that this is an unsustainable model? I mean, it really starts, you know, with the rebuilding of Lebanon, of Rafiq Hariri. And there, of course, it's done with a lot of debt, external debt, high interest rate flows and all that. But at least there was a bet, you know, the bet of regional peace, that there will be a return in terms of growth. One could, you know, criticize the realism of this bet, but there was a clear upside there. And that goes up the roof at much higher level than we have today, right? It goes up to 180% of GDP or so. But by the time of the demise of the prime minister, already growth was faster than interest rates, and debt ratios in 2005 were starting to come down. And then we had the financial crisis that attracted more money to Lebanon, and Lebanon grew fast on real estate and other things. And it's really around 2011 that one could start to realize that this system cannot work anymore, where growth collapsed. While global interest rates were very low, our nominal interest rates remained very high, and so the gap with the international rate was very high by then. And this is really when it was, in a sense, a point of no return. And so we can ask ourselves why there was no realization in 2011 that something very serious needed to be done in terms of adjustment, maybe even debt reduction, devaluation, certainly, to make Lebanon more competitive then. And I think we need to introduce a bit of political economy into this discussion. I mean, clearly, the governments we had until at least 2011, probably a few years before, these governments of national unity were not able to deal with even small problems, let alone big problems. You know, moreover, this kind of broad coalitions became extremely hungry in terms of mobilizing resources for their patronage. And so from the state perspective, the state was being sucked. The deficit became very difficult to reduce. You know, salaries increased, spending couldn't come down. And moreover, I mean, to advertise my work a little bit, the private sector became extremely monopolized over time, with cronies receiving privileges to monopolize markets, and this weighted very heavily on growth. So we really got into a growth trap starting in 2011, harder to export also, the regional situation, I mean, all of that, but internal conditions as well, very weak governance. And by then there were two problems in addition to the macro problem, more structural, that were very clear in the economy. The saving rates were very low. You know, national savings were negative, and when you take out the government, which was kind of this saving, households also with firms were this saving. And so we had negative saving rates. We're really living around above our means, and the economy was not growing. And so there was no return on all this borrowing. And moreover, the currency became overappreciated. You know, tight monetary policy to keep the peg, you know, inflation and no devaluation, and increasingly export became less competitive. Our skilled labor force increasingly had to leave because there was no job for them here. And so, you know, the economy became weaker and weaker over time. So when we think about the future, we need to think not just in terms of the pain of the adjustment. I mean, clearly to live on $4 or $5 billion of export and twice that of export of goods and services, our income will have to come down a whole lot. But then we want to be on a rising path, and we want to get a feed where we're going. So we need to go to a more productive economy. We need to devalue to become more competitive, and we need to create jobs here. And we need a state that ultimately is probably larger, because our state, when you take out interest, is at only 20% of GDP. It's a very minimal state. And so there are a lot of, there are several rather, deep features of the structure that we want to repair. So when we talk about the transition, and maybe I'll leave that to Amir, we want a transition that not only gets us to absorb our losses quickly, but to absorb them in a way that put us on a rising trend. A bit of a, we don't want to go a Venezuela way where we get stuck in a hole of distributive fights and those non-linearities that you will speak about again, but rather we want to be on a path where our banks can be revived and our firms that are productive do not go bankrupt, that survive the crisis, so that we can rise a la Greece, if you like, or a la Portugal in the future.
عامر يعني كب الطابل عندك.
No, it sets me up for failure, actually. Like,
by the way,
how do you get out of this?
How do you get out of this? And
no, but before,
I mean, what is the policy toolbox? I mean, what are the things that others have done? What should be done to mitigate the current situation and get us on the,
virtuous path.
On a virtuous path.
Absolutely.
I mean, and if I can just also ask you is, while you're talking about the virtuous path, perhaps then we can also move to what does it cost us not to move onto this virtuous path? Yani, the optimal scenario, but also the kind of, we know the Venezuela scenario, which is the one we're on now, do nothing, but the kind of in between.
Let me frame your question a little bit more, if you don't mind, and then I'm going to go back to the virtuous cycle, because I think it's an incredibly important one. In many ways, I think what you're suggesting is that the cost of doing nothing at this stage is non-linear, right? It's non-linear. It's existential. It's the kind of thing that could get you into a kind of a collapse whose results and implications are, I don't think anybody can foresee, right? In the sense that could be quite problematic in a very dangerous sense. And I don't think that should be an option whatsoever, right? In which case, I mean, let's all leave. No, but the point I'm making here, at least it would be criminal and immoral to allow the kind of collapse that would be present if we as a society, we as policymakers don't work. There is a virtuous cycle, as I want to get back into, but then there's always also the muddle through. How do we survive in the current political reality over the next 2 years in order to be able to do the right thing later on and put ourselves on that virtuous path? But it's always good, analytically at least, to define the extremes. I think the first extreme is the one that I think I mentioned at the beginning, which is the one where economic output collapses at a level that is incredibly socially problematic, and or the nominal anchor disappears and currency widens sharply, and as a result you get into a very high level of inflation that cannot be controlled in the future. What does it take to do the virtuous cycle, the alternative extreme, right? Ishaq put it beautifully, right, in the sense that he sort of was describing how things were developing and how we got to the point of no return in 2011. But implicit in what he was saying is that every year we were delaying the inevitable was a year in which the stock of the problem was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Right? So the problem in 2011 was already big. By 2012 it became bigger. By 2020 it's become extremely big. The point I'm making graphically here is that we're living with a stock problem right now, not just a flow problem, right? Now we have a level of indebtedness something that we need to be, in order to put ourselves back on the virtuous cycle, we need to compress the balance sheets. We need to de-lever this economy so that it can get the breathing space that it needs. Again, implicit in this, just keeping it at a very, very intuitive level, that level of debt requires resources to service it that is being taken away from the real economy. So the only way we can go back and providing oxygen back into the real economy is by collapsing the balance sheet and delevering, right? So deleverage is at the core, to my mind, of the virtuous cycle, right? And there are 3 balance sheets that need to be cleaned up, And to be very clear, these are sort of arithmetically, it's very easy to talk about. Like I call them the F9, the spreadsheet answer of how do you clean the balance sheets. But these are real resources that we're going to have to wipe out in order to put back ourselves on it. Right? You have the public sector indebtedness, right? Which on the face of it is very large, but the reality is it's actually larger than it seems. And the reason it's larger than it seems is because at some point the public sector is going to have to take over at least part of the stock of debt of the other two groups that I'm going to be talking about, right? So the fiscalizing the debt of the private sector and the banking sector is a burden on the public sector. At the time, and not to be too geeky about it, when the denominator, this economy, is larger nominally than it really deserves to be, right? This is not a $60 billion economy. This is more like a $40 billion economy. So as a percentage of GDP, not only is the debt of the public sector very high, I'm sorry, in nominal terms it's very high. As a percentage of GDP, it's actually higher than it seems because the denominator is quite high as well. The problem is once you clean up the balance sheet of the public sector, the owners of the debt, right, are going to have to be impacted. And the reality is most of the Lebanese debt is not owned by external forces. They're owned by people like myself, by BlackRocks of the world. But the reality is they're mainly owned by the domestic banking sector. So there's another balance sheet that is needed, another form of disintermediation, another form of delevering that is needed in order to put ourselves back in that virtuous cycle. That's very expensive, it's very difficult, and we need to think about who shares the burden of that. And here, by the way, incidentally, there's a sort of side question, the parenthetical question of the central bank and the central bank's balance sheet. But let's put that parenthetically on the side as well. The third balance sheet that also needs to be sort of cleaned up is the point that is happening. The private sector's savings rate has been very low. The private sector has also borrowed a lot. There's a lot of leverage in the private sector as well. And that's also a balance sheet that needs to compress. So to put ourselves on a virtuous cycle, we need to be thinking about a way of cleaning up these balance sheets and crucially ensuring the future generations, the future investors of Lebanon, that problem will not be recreated. So not only do you need to compress the balance sheet, you want to make sure that the flow problem in the future has also improved, which means at its core, the fiscal authorities have to get their house in order, right? The public sector debt should not be allowed to rise again. So we need to do something structural on the fiscal side as well. So how do we put ourselves on the virtuous cycle? Through a deleveraging process that is thought both on the assets and the liability side, and ensure ourselves that the flow problem is not recreated in the future. Not easy at all, but.
Basically, as an economic czar, this is what you would be doing. But let me, very low probability. Let me move to Haneen and ask you about perhaps, let's go back a bit to the social, before I think we kind of talk a little bit about the, maybe with you, Isha, and with others, a bit on the current scenario, which is the muddling through scenario, which is where we seem to be going. So Haneen, could you tell us a little bit more in terms of what are the mitigating measures that need to be done, and that maybe also that others have done who've gone through a similar crisis, at least on the social level, to make sure that people are protected, that children remain in school, that they don't miss out on vital health checkups, etc. They're getting the proper health care. I mean, all the fundamental things that at least keep some people alive, unfortunately.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, in a way, maybe akin to what Amr and Saad were saying, Lebanon also has to think about how it's going to rebuild, in a way, its human capital. And already before the crisis, it had a very weak social protection system. As you all know, private sector doesn't even have a pension scheme. There's just an end-of-service indemnity. Health insurance is kind of random. If you happen to be lucky and know somebody, you can get total hospitalization for free. Otherwise, you know, you have to stand in line if you can afford it. Education had huge inequities. And by the way, I open a parenthesis here. 2 weeks ago, the Pisa results were released. Pisa is an international, one of the international assessment exams that countries participate in, and it tests 15-year-old students in math, science, and reading. And out of 80 countries, Lebanon, unfortunately, was the fourth from the bottom. But more interesting in that is that
This
if
is
you look
before-
at those
before they
fourth
used
on
to
the
win.
bottom. No,
Well, we were
Lebanon was
upper,
always
no?
on international exams,
Okay.
not doing very well. But what's interesting there is that if you analyze it again by socioeconomic groups, you see that those in the rich versus those in the lower socioeconomic group, in terms of, let's take reading outcomes, the difference between those two groups is equivalent to 4 years of education. So, I mean, the inequity in the system is very, very large also. So yes, you've got top grade and so on, and those who go to Harvard and so on, but really in terms of a mass education. Anyway, so all that has to be looked at in a new Lebanon, if we're talking about a new Lebanon. These are medium-term reforms that need to be taken. But what can be done now? What needs to be done now to arrest the poverty, the increase in poverty, to arrest the degradation of human capital, the dropout rates? We've been looking at this and thinking about using a current system which exists in Lebanon and scaling it up. It's about going to scale. And in fact, one of the things we know from other countries that go through crises, you want to build on what you have and scale it up to create a totally new, unemployment insurance program now in Lebanon, which would have been ideal if Lebanon had it, but it don't. That would be very difficult in a crisis. You want to see what you have and scale it up. Unfortunately, there is a small but well-functioning program that provides food vouchers through debit cards to poor families. It's used for refugees, but a small number of Lebanese households, 10,000 households or 50,000 people are receiving it. It works very well. So this needs to go up from 50,000 people to the kind of numbers I was telling you about before, at least 500,000 people. This needs to be scaled up. Database exists. So there is a way to work through this and try to get to people very quickly. But it's going to require resources and funding, and we've been doing some of the numbers on this to really try to make a big impact and at least bring those who fell under the poverty line to pre-crisis level of consumption. We're talking about annually like a $700, $800 million type of program annually in terms of almost like cash support. This have to be part of whatever package or reprioritization that the new government, when it comes in, is to put in place. How it's to be funded, this is another conversation, but that has got to be a priority, at least to kind of cushion a little bit as the economy is going through what it's going. We think education cash grants should also be explored and implemented for the families. But this is really, in a way, this will, we had Dil Wada in a way, but there's going to be a lot of other repercussions socially. I mean, the fact that unemployment rate, which we don't know what it's going to be, but you'd expect that this would go further. And as I said in the beginning, people don't have that kind of protection here. The NSSF itself, or whatever little it does provide, is under financial threat. Most of its assets are invested in T-bills, and then they have a lot of government arrears to them. So that as an institution, which if it goes under, and it's possible, will affect 1.5 million people who are directly or indirectly supported by it. So the magnitudes are big, and I think the new government's going to have a huge agenda. It's going to be absolutely urgent to get on the ball with this. Other countries, yes, have done that. Korea, as I mentioned earlier, scaled up its unemployment programs, its public works programs, and increased its spending on social safety net. Actually, before the financial crisis, it was really spending very little on that. It went up to about 3% of GDP in the height of the crisis, how much they were allocating. And I think this is potentially the kind of magnitude Lebanon needs to start to think about to be able to absorb some of the shock.
Thanks, Haneen. I think what's also, just to put at least a little ray of sunshine into this and into the gloom and doom scenario that we're painting. And the one remarkable thing I think about Lebanese society is the sense of solidarity that we're seeing. And I think we shouldn't forget that. The problem is that given the scale of the situation, given the number of people who will need support, this will not be enough. We're already seeing multiple initiatives across the board to try and feed people, make sure that they have adequate clothing, make sure that we already know the pressure on the public sector system has increased tremendously in the last few months as people pull out their kids from private schools, move them to the public school system, and NGOs jumping in and trying to help and support this. So there is a network of solidarity, but it's really not sufficient and cannot be the only answer. There needs to be a lot more, as you're describing, moving forward with the right institution. But I think also what I'm reading into what you're saying is that moving forward, as we talk about what can be done, whether it's the muddling through scenario or the ideal one, we will need to maintain the notion that austerity, that somehow improving our fiscal situation will come from reducing or tightening the belt on social services is a myth. Because already we don't spend enough, and already we don't have, and our institutions are, they're not that well financed to begin with. I mean, there are problems within the institutions and the spending patterns. Am I correct in my reading?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's being spent on social is actually very inefficient. A lot of waste, whether you look at education sector, health, but certainly safety net has actually been small. And that needs to be expanded, and the other two sectors need a serious readjustment. You have also pensions, that's a whole big area, civil and military pension, which is a very significant part of government spending, going to a very small number of people. Something like 10% of the labor force are costing the government taxpayers 3% of GDP.
Thank you. That's, you've made your point there. The problem is, I think, just to say a couple of words on the political implications of this, and maybe then we can move to the, or actually, why don't I ask you, Ashha, before we get into the more political implications of this, where do you see the current kind of muddling through scenario going? How do you see it developing?
Right.
And, how would it look like?
What's kind of paradoxical when you look at the situation is that there are really still three spheres that are quite distinct. I mean, let's not forget this country is going through a revolution. So there is a revolutionary circle, the street, that's very active and increasingly playing a political role. Then you have the political circle, where the political elites are trying to make some deals, and then there is the financials, and in the middle of all this is the real economy that we're barely starting to talk about. I mean, I should say in parenthesis that we're all, including the best specialists that are in that room, still very ignorant of what can happen, because this was a very brutal wake-up call from a very long story where we got used to all kinds of things. So we're discovering what is possible. I think I see people increasingly understanding the financials, but we're still somewhat far from understanding the real economy implications of all those and the social and how we pull out. So, I mean, clearly we have a scenario here where there is an orderly fiscal with fixing EDL and collecting more taxes and maybe the stolen goods and putting a safety net, and there is an orderly resolution of the losses distributed to the rich and not to the poor, and there is an orderly fixing of the real sector as well, and this is going to require a strong government, and we can ask ourselves, I think that's our political story, whether the old regime government will kind of bury the system by doing the Bankruptcy Act, or whether we need to move to the Third Republic before we can seriously get into cleaning this system and moving to a better system. I think that's the big question. And on the other hand, the muddling through, according to me, is that this regime could survive probably a little bit longer. Things will get worse, but after all, we haven't talked about central bank reserves yet. There is still $30+ billion floating there. They are gross and not net, and but still, there are money. That is something a regime can live on. until they go to court. I mean, you know, you could spend 5 billion or so to ease the pain of not being able to import with capital controls, not recognize that this money is owned by banks. You could, you know, when this problem gets worse, you could accept a larger devaluation. You can Lebanize some of the deposit. I mean, there are all kinds of things in which the current system could survive a little longer. You know, while getting the economy become more depressed, the devaluations will hurt the poor. We'll have more inequality, distributional fights. More firms would disappear.
Destruction of wealth.
Destruction.
Genuine destruction of wealth.
Destruction of what? Of social trust. Destruction of working habits of firms. Destruction of business trust. That will make it much harder in the future to get into the good path. And so rather than simply leaving to the Third Republic a country in bad shape, it could well be that the new republic will inherit a country in ruin in a few years. And so that's a preface to what you're going to tell us about what's politically feasible now.
I think, yeah, go on.
The beauty of these kinds of panels is that they sort of allow a little bit of an intellectual conversation, an intellectual discussion. Because I think part of me sort of, I've been here for a week now. Obviously, I come here quite often, but a week thinking and talking to quite a bit of people about this. And part of me wants to also demystify and maybe slightly in defense of the muddle through. Right? In the sense that we also don't want to make the perfect the enemy of the good. That there's a notion at this stage that sort of pushing for corner solutions will end up with most likely the worst case. If the best case is too hard, chances are you end up with the worst case, the one where you do nothing and you end up with the scenario that we do nothing and we completely collapse. Right? We do have some margins of maneuver here. And not to be dystopian, I think we should be thinking about the margin of maneuver until we get to the political point where we can hopefully, and I want to get back to what is the trigger point, how do we turn around? But we do have few things that we can play with, right? In the 1980s, a lot of the emerging market crises were dealt with, not solved, dealt with through this concept of a flow rescheduling. Right, so debt service payments gets rescheduled as opposed to the principal gets written off. I think Saad's right. Reserves should probably be sort of thought about rational use of reserves. The ingenuity and sort of the deep, not ingenuity, that's the wrong word, the deep asset base of wealthy industrialists and financiers, Lebanese abroad, could be relied upon under a rational model-through scenario to be brought back, right? It has to be as part of an internally consistent model-through scenario. And finally, and probably the most importantly, we need to go to the foreign official community and ask for some foreign influence. So if we get a combination of an interest rate relief, maybe some usage of reserves, maybe some recapitalization by banks using their foreign resources, maybe some inflows back into a country that is now much cheaper because of the currency devaluation, and hopefully some funding from the official sector, we could get into this sustainable, we buy ourselves some time, right? Crucial though, and I would never advise this, and I would never recommend this, if it weren't for the possibility that the end of that tunnel, there's a promise. So it has to be a credible model through. I fully recognize it's not easy to put the political credibility around kicking the can down the road. It's not easy. But perhaps, in the absence of the ultimate solution and fearing the worst case, maybe we should be thinking of a model through here that gives us a time, so long as we can assure the international community, assure the depositors, assure the private sector that there is something at the very end of that. Very hard, but that, at least to me, that's maybe the second best that we should be pushing for here, as opposed to the ultimate one.
Thanks, Amir. Just to kind of do it as a bottom line straight up, what this country needs now is an immediate injection of cash. Okay, which is why you're suggesting we go to the IMF and to the international community to get that immediate. Though, however,
and the
this will
flow relief, the
and the flow relief,
importance of like sort of some form of moratorium on interest payments, not principal, or at least not haircuts, but more of a for rescheduling as opposed to a stock solution.
A rescheduling, but as part of a broader package that at least buys us some time with the idea that some of the more painful stuff can be done. But at this point, one cannot underestimate the urgency of moving forward with trying to get some sort of an agreement for fundamental changes, including possibly debt restructuring. Now, basically, we cannot wait. And in our conversations, you've also discussed the notion that one shouldn't wait until March when the next payments are due.
I think if we're going to go down the path of interest rate relief, we should start thinking about it now. Well, we can't wait, right? So this is the sooner we can think about this, the better. And this, by the way, this is not just on external debt, right? This is, but I cannot overemphasize it. This has to be part of a comprehensive, internally consistent, credible package where we can give assurances to whoever we're asking for an interest rate relief that down the road we're dealing with the structural problems of the country, which are both dealing with the stock and ensuring them that the flow, that where the problem will not be repeated in the past, will not repeated in the future, sorry.
Just to say, I mean, before we kind of wrap it up a little bit, to say a little bit about the political implications, frankly, of not doing nothing, of not doing anything. And I think everyone in this room probably can say a lot more about it, but it's not just about the slow political disintegration of the country. My particular concern is we're going to see, because the state is not in a position to provide the kind of support needed, as things get more and more difficult, unless hopefully at least the program you're advocating for, or you're trying to kind of scale up, kicks in, the scenario we're getting into is that regions are going to be left to themselves, to fend for themselves to some extent. And we're seeing some political parties preparing for this, while others simply don't have the infrastructure to prepare for something like this. So the political repercussions, the increase in poverty and people not being able to feed their children. And we saw seven people commit suicide, actually, in the last, I think, 2 weeks. This would be a tip of the iceberg. Not to do an Armageddon, but this is where things are going if we continue to do nothing. People will get poorer. People won't be able to feed their children, and this is already happening in some areas which are already very poor. This will lead to social unrest. We'll see new kinds of people on the streets. It will lead to more insecurity. And I mean, I think these are things we can all see happening if we continue moving down this path. The political implications for the current political class are also disastrous. They will be held accountable by the population at large for the state of affairs. People will be turning to them for help, but they won't be able to offer that help because they simply don't have the resources to offer that. So on this very sober note, I'm just going to ask Amer, Haneen, and Isha if they have any last-minute thoughts before we open it up to the audience.
My 30 seconds is exactly, I think that just to introduce a moral aspect to this, there's a moral failure, that borders on the criminal if we don't do something quite fast. The implications of not doing anything are incredibly deep. I'm not convinced that we, at this stage, we can politically, sort of as a political construct, as a political paradigm, we can deal with the ultimate solution, not with the kind of environment we're living in. So at the very least, we should do something to stabilize the situation while credibly give a commitment to a medium-term, long-term solution.
Well, I mean, certainly just to re-emphasize how important, and here now, if I put my World Bank hat on, this is social safety net is the #1 priority for us. If we do nothing else in the crisis, or asked to do nothing else, this is the only thing that we would support the government and the people of Lebanon. And we're thinking of how, these funds need to be programmed in a way to go directly to beneficiaries and as fast a way as possible, transparent, open methods. So this is something we're very committed to and are just waiting for the letter of request from the government.
I mean, I don't see a somewhat acceptable muddling through scenario myself, because I mean, you could simply reduce interest rate and imprison capital through capital flows, and that is the only way of kicking the can down the road. Where are you going to get liquidity from? I mean, this is just not hitting the big fortunes, that's all, and hitting them on a year-to-year basis and hitting everybody else at the same time. The IMF will never come in a situation like this. They will ask for very deep debt reduction because they're going to lend to the country and they want to be repaid in 3 years to 5 years. So it has to be creditworthy. They will ask for a very deep debt reduction to 50% of GDP or something. So to wipe out $60 billion of debt or so. That's what they will ask. Can you hope to get money from the GCC so we live another year or two? Politically, it's probably a big, I mean, the conditionality is enormous, right? And so I just don't see that solution. So it seems to me the next government will have to deal with the crisis one way or another. And maybe that's, after all, the right path. The old regime will have to clean up after itself, and the people would realize that this is the end of the chapter, and we will move to the Third Republic after the next cabinet.
I think the big challenge, I think, here is how, and I know the GCC is not going to give us funding, and definitely anybody who's going to come in with funding, whether it's the EU, whether it's anyone who's going to come in with funding, they will only come in if the IMF is involved in one way or the other, and where they don't trust, they don't trust our political leadership nor our institutions to deliver. So we won't go into that. But however, I think the problem today we're also facing is there is no political consensus, neither around the current PM designate, nor around the kind of very difficult decisions that will need to be taken. And I think that also is one of the biggest challenges we're going to face in the next, because you need somebody to be able to take action and have that backing of every political party to be able to implement, and that's simply not available. It's still not available. People, their backdoor deals are still ongoing. Anyway, I will stop right here and I'll open it up for questions. I can already see hands going up. Dr. Saidi, خليني أبلش معك. And then
Thank you. I hate to say this, but the panel is a bit optimistic.
oh my God. Wow.
Let's just backtrack a little bit. We have, in fact, three main crises. We have a major political crisis. And in fact, the political crisis underlies the other crises that we are living. We have an environmental and ecological crisis, very important for health and society. And third, we've got a social economic crisis. And of course, what we mentioned, a fiscal, monetary, and banking crisis. This economy does not need more cash. What we've been doing for the past 15 years is precisely kicking the can down the road and getting more cash at very high rates, which is why we've accumulated so much debt, both to protect an overvalued exchange rate, to finance budget deficits. And let's recall the numbers. Average budget deficit over the past 5 years has been 8% of GDP, yeah? At a time at which growth has been practically nil. So why do I say this is, you can no longer muddle through, and why do I say we're being optimistic? And then I'll say what sort of things perhaps we should be doing. You have capital controls, you have payment controls. Already we're seeing unemployment rate rising. People are getting paid half their salaries or quarter of their salaries. Many of them now are working half-time at best. you already have a virtual devaluation, a depreciation of the Lebanese pound by around 30% in the markets. So real wages, in effect, for most people who are getting paid in Lebanese pounds are down 30%. Okay? Now, what sort of issues do you need to address? The major one, as Amr was, and as all of you were pointing to, is you've got a stock problem and a flow problem. The flow problem, which is the budget deficit at the core, is not simply spending versus revenue. It is also structural reforms that we need to put in place. So what you need to address is both the stock of the debt, that is how do you deleverage government, how do you deleverage the central bank, how do you deleverage the banks. And what that means, whether we like it or not, is going to mean having a debt haircut. Now you can transform it in different ways. You can do a reprofiling of the debt, which is an elegant and classical way of saying, I will pay you in 10 to 15 years, and in the meantime, you'll just earn 1% on that. That is feasible. That is feasible. We can do that because much of our debt is owned to ourselves, and much of it is Lebanese pounds, and including the foreign debt. So we can smooth the adjustment by letting the banking sector being paid over a long period of time. What that means is another R. It means a recapitalization of the banks. It means a bail-in of the banks. It means a restructuring of the banking sector. At the same time, you have to say to yourself, well, I cannot continue with an exchange rate which is overvalued. We cannot go back to a peg, so you have to be realistic. There is no muddle-through scenario any longer. خلاص سعيد انتهى. So you have to say to yourself, I've got to move away from the peg, maybe accept the current rate, but you only do that if you have the fiscal adjustment at the same time. Don't depeg, or don't say you're going to depeg if you don't do the proper policy sequencing, that is, you do a strong fiscal adjustment. So the bottom line is as I'm looking ahead, is to say you need a multilateral package where you're going to have to involve the IMF. It may sound like a dirty word, but we have not had any credible policymakers at any level, as I've seen over the past 10 years. What you need is somebody to tell them what needs to be done. And unfortunately, the only way that's going to happen is by having somebody like the IMF with all the Paris 4 participants coming in to put together a multilateral stabilization and liquidity fund. I estimate that you're going to need something like 20 to 25 billion. Yeah? So double said, forget just about infrastructure, talk about stabilization and liquidity with a social safety net that you're going to put together. It has to be time consistent. That is, if you look at the dynamics in terms of the debt, people have got to look ahead and say, yes, there is light at the end of the tunnel, so I'm willing to repatriate some capital. I'm willing to inject some capital. So that multilateral package is something that is feasible. I know there is willingness to help on condition that, of course, you have a credible government. You deal with corruption. You deal with corruption which is critical. Nobody's going to give any more money to Lebanon, including the Lebanese themselves, if they know it's going to be going down the drain of corruption, waste, bribery, and all the rest that we know. So I think it's much worse to come. But I think we just have a few months. And the program that I mentioned can be put together in about 2 to 3 weeks. Doesn't require more than that. We know the numbers. We know what needs to be done. And we have some very competent people who are able to do that. But there is no time. It's not a matter of a cash injection. It's a matter of serious and deep reforms.
We've been talking or analyzing the economy, the formal economy, looking at the numbers of the formal economy. I'd like if you can give us some insight about the informal economy that we have, which is probably around 20% of our GDP. What is going to happen? How are they going to dominate, the formal economy? They are the ones who are really involved in the corruption and the smuggling and they don't appear in the numbers that we all look at. But what is going to happen to that aspect of the economy, and how are we going to protect ourselves from, an invasion or a takeover of the informal economy over our formal economy?
Just to really agree with Ishaq and Dr. Saidi that the modeling through scenario, again, it's not a scenario that we should probably promote, or as professionals to promote. I would say the policy has been over the past few years to kick the can. The policy has been that the modeling scenario in my mind is a scenario that's until your last dollar and your last cent, and this should not work anymore. And just a question to you, my understanding of it, a modeling scenario will continue with a tight monetary and fiscal policy for longer, less upside and more downside, while a virtual scenario will be probably a tight monetary and fiscal policies, but for shorter period, more upside and less downside. Do you agree?
We're talking so much about the economy, but the politics, I think that it's really important. You talk about dealing with corruption as if
Can I
that's
suggest that people introduce themselves, actually?
Okay. Dr. Patricia Nabti, cultural anthropologist. Talk about dealing with corruption as if that's we can deal with it. It's, yes, kicking it down the road or whatever. I'd like some recommendations to the street. The reality is we have people in power who don't want to give up power, obviously, because it is not in their interest, and it somehow is in their interest to kick it down kick the can down the street, when in fact we all know that that's going to, lead to destruction of the economy. So my concern is, how does one get us out of this if one says, deal with corruption? Well, how do we deal with corruption when we have the current political leaders that we have? Please, some guidance, if you would, recommendations to the street, to the people out there, as to what we can do to make this happen, when obviously years after year after year, nothing's happening positively. And the people in power don't have problems with electricity and garbage and all the other things that the people out in public do have. And so they have no problem kicking it down the can down the street. But for the people, obviously, we have great problems.
Thank you. We'll take one more question here, and then we'll move here.
Hello, my name is Walid Naushi. You spoke about the financial solutions, but I must agree with the doctor here that our problem is much bigger now than economy, because the economy right now, what created the economy problem and the political problem are just a mess with each other now, and there is no way out from one without getting out from the other one, and therefore finding a solution today to the financial problem can technically be an impossibility with the political problem. So we can try and scratch our head from today till 10 years, as long as the political system is there, the way it is, the way it wasted our money. And no one really, you spoke one time about a Ponzi scheme, one time. You mentioned it, and you mentioned one time capital control. Ponzi scheme is exact word, what happened to the people's money by its government. The government took the people's money, their saving, used it up and down, paying interest here and there, and lured everybody. And 10% of interest on dollars is something very interesting for people that are a little bit greedy in the way Madoff did it. If you think Madoff, how he answered, he said greed. So people got stuck in this. But right now with the political situation and what we have right now, it's going to be extremely difficult to get out of this economy problem. And, you know, I mean, I see it much darker than everybody. I hope I'm wrong. I see blood, I see war, because those people are not going to get out tomorrow and say thank you.
And I thought I was painting an Armageddon. Okay. Well, I'll move to Ishaq. Why don't we start with you, and then we'll move to the others.
Thank you. I mean, trying a few answers. Maybe I'll start with you. I mean, you know, corruption, yeah, I agree completely, is not a cancer that can be just removed. Corruption is embedded into a political system. And I mean, to say something maybe not very popular, I don't think that our leaders stole billions of dollars and put them in Switzerland. They distributed most of them to the people. We lived in a clientelistic patronage system. In each community, communal leaders have clients, they have to pay them, first circle, second circle. This needs to be studied. I mean, it is studied. Lebanon is the case where all sociologists and anthropologists come to study communitarian systems.
They also, I think, took some money out.
And they certainly took some money out. Certainly part of it was to bind the elite together, but it's not all of it. And, but the important point is that this system requires to collect rents. And as less money is coming, where is the rent in Lebanon? It's this flows. This is our oil, right? We are a rentier state because politicians learned how to use the flow of money coming in and took advantage of it. Now that it stopped, they can't tax anymore. This political system is bankrupt together with the rest of the economy. So this is the perfect time to change system, actually. People that are in the street, some of them were in another street, but have moved now to the People's Street because the old street doesn't function anymore. So, I mean, there is a major political change in the making. And of course, we can think that some of the political groups, elite, can survive in a very poor economy more than others. And so maybe we'll end up with one of those groups that have more weapons against the streets, and that would be the ultimate fight for the future of the country. But we won't have all the leaders, the traditional leaders, able to fight anymore because they can't even pay their troops anymore. So we certainly have to look in this situation at the balance between power and money. It is at the center. I cannot say much about the informal economy, but just a few thoughts. I mean, clearly in the bad scenario with a big gap between the formal exchange rate and the informal, this is going to lead to tremendous rent-seeking and contraband and you know, create major distortions in the economy. That's one. Another, you know, our current account deficit is 25% of GDP, is very large. The real one is probably lower because, you know, probably, you know, some merchandise and oil was moving to Syria, so before against dollar coming into the economy. So the real problem is probably smaller than what we think. A final thought on this. I mean, before the crisis, a lot of the ills of the country were attributed to the refugees. And interestingly, we haven't heard from the street anybody speak against refugees. I mean, so that was clearly used as a scapegoat for the real problems of the country.
It's still being used as a scapegoat.
It's still, probably. But nevertheless, I mean, the fact that there are unskilled labor force in the country has made our service industry extremely labor intensive. And so the you know, skilled people being pushed out of the tradables because of the appreciation of the exchange rate weren't able to move into the non-tradables and had to move out. That's a structural issue in our economy. I mean, I think in the future, you know, if we think of an export-led economy, then the unskilled and the skilled become much more complementary than substitute. And, you know, having cheap labor in addition to skilled labor in Lebanon will be a real force when we start pushing agro industries out and tourism and cultural goods and the like. And so I think the informal economy would become much more complementary to the productive formal economy.
Hani, do you want to say anything?
I mean, actually, news to you. I don't know if you noticed last week when the CAS released the labor force survey. In fact, the level of informality is 55%. 55% of employment is in informal sector in Lebanon. Yeah, this is 2018. We suspect a lot of this increased since 2011, yeah, so and that's a very big challenge. Now, not all informal work is bad, or informality is not necessarily bad per se. You have to kind of, is it something that somebody chooses, or is it forced upon you in terms of being in the informal sector? And of course, the definition there is if you're covered by Social Security or not. That's the definition normally used. But so I think it's going to be quite an uphill battle to try to turn that around. I mean, you're going to just need the kind of very different economic model, this is saying, that's going to start to absorb some of this up. I mean, on the corruption, just to say that I think now in the new environment, after the revolution and through the revolution and how it continues, I think that's going to be, it's very important to think of, for example, mechanisms like watchdog mechanisms that would really act as watchdogs to whatever government is in place in terms of doing things differently. Business is not as usual anymore. Not an easy area, but I think, one is heartened by the civil society movements, the lawyers, the reactivation, hopefully, of the role of the judiciary. I mean, this is what it's going to be about, working with and strengthening these institutions and really having civil society act as the watchdog to the authorities.
Can I just add a word before you go, Amir, into just the informal issue? I think also, again, on the political and social repercussions of the current crisis, a lot of the informal businesses are small and mom and pop shops. They're not necessarily in the illegal and smuggling. And many of these don't have social security, they don't have health insurance. So the impact of their businesses shutting down is even more tremendous because they have no other sort. They're already vulnerable by being in the informal economy. And I think this is something also that we will need to look at quite carefully. 55% is quite alarming. Sorry, Amir.
No, absolutely. This is, in a sense, sort of a response to both Saad Hariri and to Saab as well. And I want to stay away from the semantics, this whole idea of muddling through versus not muddling through, kicking the can down the road or not. To me, the more profound point, or the more organic point I'm trying to make is that it's about the pace of what we need to do, right? There is a reality out there right now of a political system that is extremely fragile, where sectarian politics is extremely entrenched, in a regional environment that is still extremely unclear and sort of undefined, against an economic construct on day one, a priori, where the contraction is already there and a severe political unrest as a result of the economic hardship that's already occurring, with inflation that's already rising. It's very easy to make the perfect the enemy of the good in a situation like this, where you ask for too much. Right? So don't take me wrong. Almost certainly the stabilization program of the kind that Dr. Said has mentioned is an absolute necessity. There is an absolute necessity right now to tighten fiscal policy, keep monetary policy quite tight. There is some form of a need of debt cleanup, right? Debt workout. How is where I want to come back to. What sort of nature does it take is what I come back to. There's clearly a need to deal with the banking sector, which at this point is clearly unsustainably broke. There is a question of the bank of BDL, which needs to also be cleaned. All of this is needed. There's probably something more rational to do about the exchange rate. The exchange rate at 1500 is unsustainable. There is a need to think about a new exchange rate arrangement that allows monetary policy to work quite fast. All of this is a necessity, without which we enter into the nonlinear. The only point I'm making is that if we ask for too much right now, too quickly, we enter into the possibility where we're asking for throws us into an Argentina style, where I was extremely close to what the Macri administration tried to do, and I worked very closely with them. And there was that attempt of creating the Third Republic, of starting and it felt good for a while. It felt positive for a while until we realized very quickly that we moved too far. And sort of happy to go through the mechanism of why that failure occurred. But not least of which is that monetary policy had to be left much tighter than we thought. So real interest rates ended up being much higher than we thought. So all I'm saying is we need to be careful about the pace, and particularly on the debt side. So as opposed to go out there right now, on two things. We need to be careful about how we think about the debt. So debt write-off right now is too dangerous. This is too big of a wealth destruction too quickly. So instead, I would rather do a rescheduling at this point of the reprofiling, the NPV reduction as opposed to a haircut, right? Smooth it out over time. And probably don't float the currency. It's too dangerous to float the currency. Now revalue it and then keep monetary policy tight. But it's dangerous. So again, it's more about the pace of what we do. And you're preaching the converted IMF. We absolutely need a package of the international community. We absolutely need it. Right. No, but again, the point here is and it's important to also think about some structural reform on the fiscal side, on the spending side as well. So all of this has to be the beginning of a package that we have to work with. But let's not be too ambitious. We can't afford to be ambitious here. We could enter into a much more dangerous zone if we are.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, I think Alex. Okay. Sorry, we just need a mic here. Rida, please.
As the mic is coming, I mean, this is really now rhetorical, because if we speak of a 50 years bond at 1%, it would probably trade at 20 cents. This is a huge debt reduction, right? We can call it rescheduling, but you're exchanging a dollar for 20, 30, 40 cents. We're probably going to have to be much more generous, capitalize the principal, give some upside on the oil, on the gas, for this to work out, right?
No, just a quick, not really a rejoinder. I do not disagree, except that for once in my life, I've seen the possibility of real change in Lebanon. I'm so encouraged by what I see in the protesters in our revolution. We cannot afford to let them down. And trying to do piecemeal is not going to work. We have gone beyond, the wall of fear has been broken. And when they say كلون معناتها كلون, they mean it. And I cannot but agree. I've been on all sides. I've seen it happen. And I think we cannot afford not to live up to the ambitions of our young people, particularly in the street. So it has to be comprehensive, it has to be holistic, it has to be credible. It means you have to rethink what government is doing and what the state is doing, because, let's face it, we are living in a failed state. There is no other description except that this is a failed state. So putting it on crutches is not going to make it run. It's not going to create the sort of economy Ishaq is talking about, where we all suddenly become productive, where we use our human capital, etc. That is not going to happen. You have to have a head cut. And what I mean by that is a political head cut.
Dr. Said, I think you've, pretty much, we're all agreeing. It's just I think what we're trying to emphasize is not, and I think I speak for everyone on the panel, is we absolutely agree with you that there needs to be a full package. The issue, the question we're asking is, what is the sequencing of this package, and when do you move into what, given how dangerous the situation is today? There's no other word for it, not to be alarmist, but this is where we are today. I'm going Dr. Haddad, and then Alia, and then Nadim. لا Dr. Haddad, and then
أنا ممنونك دكتورتيني بس ماني دكتور. I would have, I think this was very, very useful and interesting, and your esteemed panel had a beautiful analysis. I am always a critical person, as you know. My little disappointment is I would have expected this esteemed panel to have a clear diagnosis. Today you go to doctors, they all give you almost the same diagnosis because medicine has advanced. The diagnosis, in my humble opinion, you have said it all. We need a cash injection yesterday. We cannot wait anymore. And there is something that is difficult to analyze scientifically. There is a big loss of confidence on the political, economic, but this is very new, the banking sector. Who would have thought, people have no. And we haven't spoken sufficiently of the central bank, in my humble opinion. So, speaking of the central bank, this issue of reserves gets me very upset. Because in order to reform, we need to be transparent, you know. When I worked at the central bank with my good friend Saif Zain, the central bank used to publish its detailed accounts every 2 weeks or every month. Okay. Today, as far as we know, or as far as I know, maybe you will correct me, the net foreign exchange reserves have been wiped out. Yani, this is a major disaster. Yani, we had a stock of foreign exchange reserves. They have disappeared. It's part of the diagnosis that should be highlighted. So yes, we need cash tomorrow, or yesterday, or today. Politics, yes, we should reform politics. I could not agree more, but politics, first of all, will take much more time. We can agree with the IMF within 2 to 3 months. Politics will take longer. Secondly, what I would like to emphasize is, pre-1975, the politics of Lebanon were superlative, messed up, graft, corruption, you name it. The economy was doing extremely well, doing much better than all its neighbors and doing well by any standard, yani, in terms of growth, human capital, blah, blah, blah. I'm not saying we shouldn't do something about the politics. I totally agree. It needs to be كلهم يعني كلهم. But this will take much more time. An IMF rescue package that will address, among other things, the confidence issue, plus at least cutting heads of politicians, but also of economic decision makers. Yani, I don't want to name the same man I name all the time, so thank you. We should talk about him and about the policies of the central bank, because this has been the constant factor over the past 26 years.
Thank you, Sami. We'll come back to this. There's the gentleman right here.
معالي الوزير is correct about البنك المركزي. I think it's the author of all of our ills. My mind goes to the crash, after which the dollar appreciated by about 30% against the euro, among things. And with the dollar appreciate against the euro, our Lebanese currency. So that makes a lot of sense. We are all talk about the free markets here. I don't know why that exchange rate was not, that peg was not broken. In fact, the belief in the peg was so intense that the gentleman got awarded lots of awards, best central bank governor in the world, etc., through the payment of heavy advertising dues to the Banker magazine, Institutional Investor, and stuff like this. And the first thing he said, I kept the peg going. How is that possible? And nobody said a word, but nobody said a word. How did we allow the country to be de-dollarized to this extent? A central bank governor who wants to manage the economy of a country needs to have his own currency, for Christ's sake. He doesn't want someone from Washington running it for him. Maybe he would want to, I don't know, but but he certainly wasn't running the economy. Forget that for a second. My real concern here is that, particularly the analysis of Dr. Saidi, which is absolutely right on, misses one step, and that is political stability. Without political stability, ladies and gentlemen, there is no economic solution. Muddling through IMF package, whatever it is, we need to arrive at a political consensus in this country. We have to. We forget that over the last 10 years, I mean, that one thing that the fellow we referred to, kept saying, we spent months without president, months without government, months without parliament, delay this, renew the mandate of the parliament. I mean, this is a mess of a country. How could you build an economy on top of that crap? How could you do that? And before anything, get the heads of these guys together and get them to produce a system that works.
Thank you. Alia, all the way in the back there.
Thank you, Maha, and thank you, Amir, Hanin, and Ishaq. It's never enough to hear all of you again and again. My name is Alia Mbayyad. I'm Chief Economist for the Middle East at Jefferies. I just want to actually be a bit more provocative than Dr. Saidi, not only because I worked with him, but because me too, I still believe that it's a great opportunity for us that we should not let go of for a reset of the whole model. Maybe politically it can be difficult, but for us who know very well the numbers, economically it is possible. And I think the question for you is, shouldn't we be much more ambitious than a simple rescheduling, which, I mean, frankly, is what the current government is asking for, is just to reschedule and provide a interest rate holiday without touching the stock problem, through some form of a haircut, and therefore going through the painful exercise of the burden sharing that you've done. I mean, many of us have done many scenarios, and what I mean by ambitious is that if you really want to bring your stock level from 160% to GDP to 100, let's say, which 100 is still probably unsustainable for a country like Lebanon. I mean, clearly a rescheduling would not be enough without a major, basically, fiscal adjustment, which socially and politically would not be feasible, and a deval that would not be advisable, given basically the real value of the pensions and the like. So my question is, shouldn't we really be ambitious? And if we fail this time, to be as ambitious as we could in terms of the burden sharing, and that is opening a very honest dialogue with the shareholders of the banks, which I'm sure many of which would like to see that reset happening, because they have skin in the game. They want to remain involved in this economy. And this is an opportunity for many of them, I'm not saying all of them, to do so. So that's my first question. With regard to the IMF, and I was at the World Bank, and I'm talking also from my own experience, having worked for 6 years in the Lebanese administration. And I've never seen the Lebanese administration, the central bank, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Economy, the CDR, all economic-related institutions, and many of whom, I'm sure, ministers who have been there. I've never seen this amount of weakness in policy formulation, policy analysis, evidence-based scenario planning for normal days, let alone for an existential crisis like this one. So, as much as I am fully agreeing with you on the need for a huge capital injection, because this is what we need for the private sector, not to continue on funding an oversight public sector, but to give livelihood for all of us here who have invested so much in this great country. So shouldn't we first, before making sure that the IMF comes in, insist first and foremost on having a team in place that can make sure that what we are negotiating with the IMF, with the donors, with our private sector, with our politician, is the best for this reset that we should be ambitious to get to? And that's my question. And I'm saying this because having worked in this administration, having known that many, of which many are in this particular room, are able to do that if they are given the chance to serve their country for 3 weeks only. I'm not saying more. So, and I'm asking Amer, because you've seen that happening in many countries. How can you ask for an IMF in a country where you don't have ownership of the reform, which many of the people on the street are asking us to do this? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Alia. I think it was Nadim. Nadim.
Thank you, Maha, and thank you all. I want to follow what Dr. Saidi said, which is that I find him optimistic, and I find the discussion so far optimistic. And I'll give you a small parable. If the caravans stop coming to the souk, no amount of restructuring or reshuffling in the souk will solve the problem. So far we've been discussing restructuring of the souk when the caravan has stopped coming. And basically we have a political problem with our main market, which is the GCC, and the timing of the problem, which is 2011. The timing, I mean, there's a correlation between our economic problems and the decline with the beginning of the political problem with the GCC. So there is an external factor which we have no control of, and which we also need help with, which is to pay the ransom for being deprived of our main market.
Okay, I think we'll, one last question and then we'll go to the panel.
Me?
Yes, for that. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes. My name is Michel Napti. I lived most of my life in the United States. I may be on the other side of the globe, and the farther away you see small Lebanon clearer. I heard a joke, or it was reality, I don't remember, many years ago, that some European specialist in economy and administration and finance was invited, whether alone or with a team, I don't remember, but to spend some time here and give his analysis and opinion of the Lebanese economy. The end result was he told the officials and the circles of academicians and whoever, or went onto the media, the press, that everything is going wrong in Lebanon, but it's working, don't touch it. And apparently this became a reality. The little Lebanon is so confused. It is like a huge space of spaghetti cooked together, and it cannot even be sorted out. We can talk economics and analysis until the century is finished. I think with this meeting, before we leave, before this meeting is finished,
Are you proposing that we don't do anything?
I'm proposing that before this meeting is dismissed, that those who are from the mind and the heart interested to get together on a regular basis in any form that can be administratively functional, to put the wisdom, the heart, the soul of the people and together to help the new administration, if there will be a new administration. Okay. Specifically to do a radical change.
Thank you.
The sick person is in the surgery room. We cannot leave the doctors to go on analyzing it beyond his death. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. We agree. Amer, do you want to start this time?
Yes, I'm happy to. Incidentally, the story you're mentioning is this thing in 1956, the Bath at Irfid. And that's the story that everybody says. It's the Irfid, it's a UN. What nobody knows is that they actually had 5 volumes. Each volume was 300 pages. So it was actually a very detailed set of recommendations. And the only thing that people remember is that they apparently said things are working. So I think we slightly, we've always had problems with this country. I mean, this is not, unfortunately, and one of the reasons we go through multiple crises is because we have structural problems in this country. Listen, I'm going to make 3 points, if you don't mind. The first is, again, in defense of political realism, right? We can't be more Catholic than the Pope, right? In the sense that it's easy to ask for the perfection. It's easy to ask for something incredibly radical, but one has to always think in terms of what is politically feasible, right? So as we enter in this incredibly difficult period over the next few months, my eagerness, my keenness is again, nobody's going to listen to me, but like I would wish that people could be politically realistic about the politics of what is feasible and what's not, and we should be scaling the program to what needs to stabilize the situation within what is acceptable rather than what is desirable, because the problem with sometimes asking what is desirable is that you throw yourself into the other side. Sami, to your point, and sort of listen, BDL is something we're spending a lot of time on, and the hole there is quite scary, right? I mean, there is a significant problem in BDL, and as part of every effort that we need to do here, we need to be thinking about this. So that the notion that this shouldn't be part of any package is extremely naive. Any serious economist is and should be thinking about BDL as an issue here. To Alia's point, no, we're not prepared. I mean, sort of it comes across. We're not very well prepared. From all the conversations we have, this is nowhere to compare to what other countries when they sit down with the international community. But it doesn't take that much, right? There is enough talent, there is enough numbers, I mean, yourself, there's enough people who can actually put together a package relatively quickly in order to sit down with them. But I don't want to underestimate the point you're making. There are many examples out there where countries that are not very well prepared can actually make tons of mistakes. And it's not like the fund, the IMF is God, right? I mean, I worked there for 10 years of my career. Mistakes get be done. So with better, and I don't know if Maha's mentioned this, part of the reason we're here is because we're trying to put together the quantitative framework so that to help the authorities when they're sitting down inevitably with the fund, they have a set of recommendations, set of numbers, set of analysis that can help them. So I don't think they're there, but I think there's enough smart people hopefully out there who can actually put together something for them and help them once they're committed.
I don't have much to add, but just to say I fully agree with Alia about the need from the government side to establish a team that can start to work on this and to reach out to all the great minds that Lebanon has to start helping on this, absolutely.
Okay, well, I have many things to say. Look, I think we shouldn't get into a competition first about how bad things are. You know, obviously things are bad, but we should think more positively. You know, it's not the end of the world. After all, we're a small country. We can certainly export $10 billion or more. We have a rich GCC, even if it's impoverished next door. We have a global diaspora that is immense. We can do better than Israel in that perspective. We are a global nation, truly. I mean, we shouldn't underestimate ourselves. All we need is a different system, a different set of incentives. And it seems to me we're at the gate of something big. We're not in 75 anymore. I mean, in 75, we had a confessional system with one confession dominating. You know, that can work. We may not like it, but it's one confession. It needs a bit of friends. Then we got 2 with Ta'if, then we got 3 and 4, and the system now has become unworkable. You may think when they're all in power, it's the solution. We don't have conflict anymore. It's exactly the opposite. You can't have a confessional system with all the confession with oligarchs trying to milk the economy at the same time. That's totally unworkable. We have reached the end of that system. So I think that's good news, actually. And we have potential. So I think we have a hard moment to pass, but then things could get better if we don't get into conflict and into distributional conflict and huge inequality. So the management of the crisis is important. Now, you know, BDL, IMF, you know, the BDL, first of all, the net value is clearly negative. Now, how much, we don't know. We don't know how much. And so the public debt is not $90 billion, it's more. It's $90 billion plus the net value of the BDL, which could be quite large. But nevertheless, the BDL has gross reserves in its hands. And we should use these reserves carefully because we really need them in the next few years to import drugs and fuel and basic necessities. So, you know, we shouldn't give them back to the creditors, even if the net is negative. The gross is positive. We should hold on to these reserves. You know, we need the IMF, but the IMF will not come with sufficient money to smooth our shock entirely. The reserve has a role to play there. And we shouldn't be paying the $5 billion getting due in a few months. And you should start raising your voice today, for not to wake up, you know, in early March and say it shouldn't be paid. There are enormous forces lobbying for this to be paid because 85% of those go to banks and to banks' profits and to shareholders. And if the decision is made the night before by someone without any public consultation, you know, it will be the wrong thing. Now,
together a creditors committee from now.
Yes, we should be lobbying from today.
From today for a creditors
now,
committee.
on IMF program, I mean, the worst thing that can happen for Lebanon is it's good to consider what's happening in the region. You know, you have Algeria on the one hand with the street against the army. They still have $50 billion in reserves, and they've been running these reserves, and possibly the system won't change until the reserve all run down. On the other hand, the only country that so far have succeeded in making some democratic progress is Sudan, because there are no reserves left, and so there's nothing left to fight on. So hopefully we can change system before we exhausted our reserves, right? But interestingly, in Sudan, where I work a lot these days, the IMF came in, and the IMF said, well, you know, I need a staff monitoring program for 6 months so that you show me your seriousness before I can even start thinking of putting money in this country. And before I put a cent in this country, you need a safety net of $2 to $3 billion, so we're not accused of being the bad guys later on. The IMF is not what it used to be. Don't think that they will come and solve the problem in 2 weeks and that we have to resist. No, we have to be very nice to them for them to come. and certainly we have the teams and the people to look over their shoulders. I mean, this is not an ignorant country, far from it. There are plenty of Lebanese people working at the IMF, you know, including the head of the Middle East region, as you know. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. On debt reduction, I think we all here agree that we need very deep debt reduction, because we won't do it once only. I mean, you don't want to get into a lost decade, like in Latin America in the 80s, where you do a little bit and then it's not enough and you get into a crisis again. We're still a country that, you know, we want to be global Lebanon. We want our expats to be sending money in this country. So we want to do it deep and say no more. And we've moved to the Third Republic, and you can trust this country again. You know, our reputation with the Eurobond market doesn't matter as much as our reputation with the Lebanese abroad. You know, the Lebanese in Africa or in other part of the world, their advantage is to be, you know, have connections with the banks and with providers in Lebanon. That's their advantage, and so they have an interest in keeping that relationship, and that's the relationship I think that we really need to repair. When we talk of a muddling through scenario, it is not because we're recommending it. It's from a positive perspective to judge whether this regime can survive longer with muddling. I think that's really the key. And I think that the conclusion is they can. The deep crisis that would displace them is not necessarily for tomorrow. You know, it may be, but I think as the crisis gets deeper and the street gets more louder, that shift in regime may happen. But as I said, the risk is that they live on these reserves until they're exhausted.
Okay, I'll just sum up maybe with a couple of words. One, the more we delay it, the worse it's getting. And I think this is something, one perhaps major conclusion that, I mean, what Amer said is the four of us have been working for some time now, trying to get a sense of how deep the hole we're in and what needs to be done, but also with many of you, many of the people in this room as well. So the longer, what could have been done 2 months ago is no longer viable today. And what is viable today will no longer be viable tomorrow. So I think this is where recommendation to the street, we need to push. And push hard on an economic emergency plan, an economic emergency team. Alia is spot on in saying, and I know there have been attempts to create this, but for some reason they kept falling, and we won't go into that. But she's spot on in saying there's incredible talent in this country. And many people, expats, are not wanting to put their money where their mouth is. They're actually doing it. They're out there, they're looking at analyzing the different sectors, trying to get a grip on what's going on, but also trying to see how they can financially help this country. So in that sense, we may be heading into an economic crisis, but it's an incredibly rich country with its human resources and people who are genuinely invested and would like to go back. ناس ما بدها تهاجر، ناس بدها تبقى بلبنان وبدها ترجع على لبنان. So I think this is another thing we really need to keep our eye on and build on. The third thing I would say, maybe as a conclusion to what also Isha and Amer and Haneen were saying, the reserves we have should be used wisely. Certainly not to pay, the debt. We need to, there should be, and this is another recommendation, lobby for a creditors committee to start talking about the debt reprofiling now, because come March, it will be too late. So begin with that now, because we desperately need those reserves for other things. Sorry? Yeah, to eat. We desperately need those reserves for other things, to prevent people from going hungry, to prevent people from dying of illnesses that have long been wiped out in the world, to make sure that students and Lebanese children and children who live in this country can continue going to school. So I think these are kind of the three main, perhaps, things we can push on as an audience, as people who live, citizens who are invested in Lebanon. First and foremost, it's a desperate situation. It's a critical situation, but there are ways out. Somebody needs to take action, and unfortunately, I agree with you, Nadeem. There are things that are completely beyond our control on the political front. The political paralysis we're seeing, and I pointed to this, I'm very worried that the way the current PM was selected means that there is no political consensus around him, which means that the kind of program that is needed, there won't be any political consensus to get it done. You need political consensus at this point. The regional issue, I completely agree with you. There are things beyond, we're not going to get into the regional politics of it, the involvement of Iran, the relationship with the GCC, the fact that Lebanon is part of larger political discussion going on between Iran and the US, among other political settlements. These are issues that at this point we're not able to control or to manage. What we can do is push on the things we do have a handle on, and where we see an immediate emergency that at least would stabilize the country for some time as we deal with the more medium and longer term. I want to end by thanking everybody for joining us today, for your questions, and that's it. Inshallah khair ala Lebanon.